That one detail, that one quiet, almost invisible confession didn't just spark whispers, it detonated an entire narrative the world thought it understood. Because long before the fairy tale cameras rolled, long before the white dress, the carriage, the global obsession, Meghan Markle had already made a decision that felt less like emotion and more like strategy. She didn't want her own father there. Not after the scandal, not after the headlines, no. Months before any of that chaos even existed, she had already drawn the line. And according to Tom Bauer, that wasn't a coincidence. That was the blueprint. Because if you follow that thread, if you dare to pull it, everything else starts to unravel. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because the father wasn't the exception. He was the pattern. First, him. Then the friends, then the inner circle, then the institution itself. One by one, piece by piece, people didn't just drift away, they vanished. And the ones watching closest, the insiders, the people who understood power, loyalty, and survival inside the royal machine, they weren't shocked. They were already bracing. Quietly, privately, because before the vows were even spoken, there were whispers that this wasn't going to last, at least not here. But the real story doesn't begin at the wedding. It begins earlier, much earlier. Years before Prince Harry ever heard her name, before that first meeting that would later be painted as destiny, something else was happening behind the scenes. Around 2013, after her first marriage collapsed, Meghan wasn't retreating. She was repositioning, calculating, moving. According to Bauer, this wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was direction, a deliberate shift towards circles that were richer, more powerful, more connected than anything she had known before. And slowly, methodically, she moved closer to a different kind of world. Then comes the moment everyone romanticizes. The first meeting, the instant connection. The spark. But what if it wasn't spontaneous at all? What if it was studied? Because Bauer suggests something that changes everything, that before that night even happened, Meghan had already done her research. Not casual curiosity, deep, targeted understanding. She knew what mattered to Harry. Africa, wildlife, purpose, escape from the spotlight. She didn't just learn about him, she mapped him. And when they finally sat across from each other, she didn't introduce herself. She presented a version of herself designed to fit him perfectly. And it worked. Completely. Instantly. Overwhelmingly. Harry would later describe it as knowing she was the one from the very beginning. But Bauer reads that moment differently. Not as fate, but as performance. A role studied, rehearsed, and delivered flawlessly. And once that connection was secured, it didn't slow down. It intensified, because what came next wasn't just affection, it was immersion, total alignment, total mirroring. Every dream Harry shared, she echoed. Every plan, she embraced. South Africa? Of course. A quiet life away from the chaos? Absolutely. They were even exploring properties together, building a future that to him must have felt real, solid, safe. But here's the unsettling part. Bauer claims none of it was ever meant to happen. Not the move, not the quiet life, not the escape. The destination, he says, was always somewhere else entirely. But to get there, she had to stay in character just a little longer. And then the pressure began. Subtle at first, then urgent. The timeline couldn't stretch too far. There was a reason given, the biological clock, the need to move quickly, the sense that time was slipping away. But Bauer doesn't believe that explanation, not even for a second. He suggests something colder, simpler. The act couldn't last forever. There was a limit to how long someone could keep playing a role that wasn't fully aligned with their true intentions. So the faster the commitment, the faster the control. And the palace? They weren't blind, not entirely. Behind the polished smiles and official statements, there were concerns. Early ones. Observations that didn't sit right. A growing realization that this wasn't someone preparing to adapt, but someone preparing to reshape. That the rules, the traditions, the expectations, they weren't being embraced. They were being assessed, tested, and possibly rejected. Then came the shift that changed everything. Not publicly, quietly, socially. It started with Harry's friends, longtime companions, people who had been part of his life for years. A shooting weekend at Sandringham, something routine, something normal, suddenly turned into something else entirely. Conversations became confrontations. Jokes became offenses. And by the end of it, lines had been drawn that couldn't be erased. According to Bauer, that was the moment everything fractured. Not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently, because after that, they were gone, and Harry let them go. And that's the part no one wants to say out loud, because once you see that shift, once you realize how fast his world started shrinking, it becomes impossible to ignore what followed. The friends weren't just absent, they were replaced, quietly, strategically. At the wedding itself, a moment that should have been filled with lifelong bonds and shared history, something felt off. Familiar faces were missing. In their place, celebrities, industry power players, people who had had barely been in their lives suddenly seated at the center of one of the most watched events in modern history. And according to Tom Bauer, that wasn't generosity, that was networking, that was positioning, that was a launch. Because the wedding, in his eyes, wasn't just a ceremony, it was a stage. Every camera angle, every guest, every detail, curated, calculated, intentional. And while the world saw romance, insiders were already seeing something else. A brand being built in real time, a platform being assembled with precision. And once that platform was secured, the real transformation began. The father situation? It didn't explode overnight. It was engineered into inevitability. The public remembers the chaos, the paparazzi photos, the heart attack, the last-minute panic. But Bauer insists that chaos was just the cover story. The decision had already been made long before any of that unfolded. Thomas Markle was never meant to be part of that wedding. Not really. And when the scandal happened, it didn't create the separation, it justified it. That's the distinction that changes everything. Because suddenly what looked like tragedy starts to feel like timing. And it didn't stop there. Her siblings? Gone. Completely excluded. No invitations. No presents. No explanation that made sense. And perhaps the most unsettling detail of all, Harry never met Thomas Markle before the wedding. Not once. Think about that. A man about to become family, kept at a distance. According to Bauer, that distance wasn't accidental. It was controlled because proximity brings unpredictability, and unpredictability breaks narratives. Meanwhile, inside the palace walls, something else was happening. The pressure wasn't just social anymore, it was operational. Staff who had served the royal family for years suddenly found themselves overwhelmed, not by the scale of the wedding, but by constant demands, constant corrections, constant friction. It wasn't collaboration, it was control. And slowly, quietly, the people who kept the machine running began stepping away. Some resigned, others simply avoided interaction altogether, because it was easier to disappear than to engage. Even Catherine, Princess of Wales, wasn't immune. A moment that should have been simple discussing bridesmaid dresses turned into something tense, something uncomfortable. Catherine offered input, tried to help, tried to play her role, but according to Bauer, she was shut down completely. No compromise, no flexibility, just a clear message, this is mine. And Harry? This is where it becomes almost tragic, because Bauer doesn't describe him as unaware, but as overwhelmed, consumed by emotion, by conflict, by a growing sense of grievance that started to reshape how he saw everything around him. The cheerful, easygoing prince people once knew, gone, replaced by someone constantly frustrated, constantly dissatisfied. A transformation so visible that even those closest to him couldn't ignore it. And Bauer places that change directly at the center of this relationship. But then comes the move that shook the foundation even further. The comparison, the echo of Princess Diana. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't occasional. It became a narrative, a shield, a reference point that carried emotional weight the royal family could never ignore. But inside those palace walls, that comparison didn't inspire sympathy, it triggered anger. Because to them, Diana wasn't assembled to be reused. She was history. Complex, painful, deeply personal history. And seeing that legacy repurposed felt wrong. Bauer takes it further. He argues that the comparison wasn't just misplaced, it was strategic. That aligning with Diana's image created a layer of protection, because criticism, when framed against that legacy, suddenly looked like persecution. And for a time, it worked. The public responded with sympathy, with concern, with hesitation to question anything too deeply. But Bauer believes that phase didn't last, that eventually people began to see through it, that the emotional shield started to crack, and while the public was still catching up, the internal situation was already deteriorating fast. The image remained polished, perfect, controlled, but behind it, burnout, tension, quiet exits. And then the ambition shifted again. Because if the royal path couldn't deliver the ultimate goal, the crown, the top position, then a new path had to be built. And according to Bauer, that's exactly what happened. Hollywood wasn't an afterthought. It was the next stage. The connections at the wedding, they weren't random, they were seeds. And once the royal chapter reached its limits, those seeds were activated. Deals, projects, media ventures, a full pivot into a different kind of empire. But here's where the narrative takes another turn, because Bauer claims that empire didn't hold, that the ambition was there, but the execution wasn't. Projects stumbled, partnerships weakened, momentum slowed, and that's when the cost becomes impossible to ignore. Because Harry didn't just change circles, he changed everything. His titles, his country, his entire identity. And Bauer paints a picture that feels deeply unbalanced. A man who gave up everything for something he believed in completely, and a partner whose motivations he questions at their core. He even raises a possibility that feels almost too cold to consider, that if the usefulness fades, the relationship might not survive it. But the most haunting part isn't what's happened, it's what's still happening. Because this story hasn't ended. It hasn't even slowed down. According to Bauer, they are now locked into a cycle where relevance depends on conflict, where the only way to stay visible is to keep the narrative alive, keep the tension alive, keep the connection to the monarchy alive, even from a distance. And that's why the stakes remain so high. Because if that connection is ever fully restored, it doesn't resolve the story, it fuels it. More access, more material, more moments to turn into headlines. And without it, the opposite risk, the fading spotlight, the shrinking influence, the question of sustainability. So when you step back, when you trace every detail, every decision, every shift, it stops looking like a love story. It starts looking like something far more complex, a collision of need and ambition, of emotion and calculation, of image and reality. And right now, it's still moving, still evolving, still unpredictable, because the truth is, no one knows how this ends. Not the palace, not the public, not even them. And if Tom Bauer is even partially right, the ending won't be quiet. It won't be graceful. It'll be the kind of moment everyone sensed was coming, but no one could stop.